So, you might have noticed our last video ended abruptly. I apologize for that. I think it was my computer's way of telling me I should stop working for the day. So you guys are listening to this at all random times, but it is very late in a Friday afternoon. So I think that there's some kind of electric force in my room that was like, you should stop recording. You should go have a glass of wine. But I couldn't leave you guys hanging with a force velocity question, so I jumped right back into it. All right, so the question was, can you lift a 30-pound weight at the same speed as a pencil? And the answer is no. You will be slower when you're lifting the 30-pound weight. And that has to do with the intrinsic nature that skeletal muscle has a force-velocity relationship. So let's start with what the question was, and that's lifting a 30-pound weight or lifting a pencil. Those are concentric contractions, shortening of the muscle. So this figure is force on the Y, right? How great is the load? So the higher up you go, the heavier the load, compared to the shortening velocity on the X. So as you head to the right on the screen, you're increasing the velocity, you're increasing the speed. And you will see that as you increase velocity, you will decrease the total maximum load that you can generate in the muscle. Whereas as you decrease velocity and you give yourself more time, you will be able to generate a greater amount of force up to your maximal force, which is at zero velocity. Because as we just mentioned, you get your maximum force with an isometric contraction, right? So zero velocity would mean you're no longer shortening. That's where the max force is at that particular length. So what's going on here? If you need to lift a heavier load, if you need to generate a greater total force within a skeletal muscle, what do you need to have happen? You need to form more cross bridges. And that does actually physically take time. It takes time to pump the calcium out and move the tropomyosin out of the way and create the binding and have the power stroke and do it again. And the more force generated, the more of those active sites you need to have open and engaging in the contraction. So if you give your muscle time, right, at a slower velocity, you will have the ability to form a greater total number of cross bridges and you'll get a greater force. Whereas the faster you go, you will decrease the total number of cross bridges simply because you don't have enough time for all those little myosin heads to grab onto all those active sites, and your total load will go down. And that is true with an concentric contraction when it comes to shortening. Oops, going the wrong way. Come back. The opposite is true when it comes to an eccentric contraction. So which could you lower faster? A 30-pound weight or a pencil? With an eccentric contraction, so let me just orient you to your figure again. So we have lengthening velocity now going in this direction, so increasing the speed. So the faster the speed, the higher the load in an eccentric contraction. Because an eccentric contraction, the external load has to exceed the internal torque of the muscle. So if you think about this like in like a lifting weights perspective, I think it's easier to think of it that way. If you lifted a weight that was just a tiny bit heavier than your maximal isometric force, it would slowly lower your arm, but you could really control it almost all the way down because it's just a hair above what you're capable of doing. It's just a little bit of a greater external load. Whereas if you did a much, much heavier weight than your maximal isometric force, with maximal eccentric activation, the load is going to fall much quicker as your muscle is trying to resist it. The logic on this is a little harder to get your mind wrapped around, but the lengthening process of an eccentric contraction is you're pulling your actin and myosin apart and then it's re-grabbing, and you're pulling it apart and it's re-grabbing. So the faster you pull on actin and myosin, the greater resistance they offer. So it's part of the component of why you can generate a greater amount of force in a lengthening contraction than in a shortening contraction. The other is just an intrinsic property that active muscles are highly resistive to forced lengthening. So it doesn't have as pretty of a picture as the concentric side, but you can generate a greater total force at higher velocities with an eccentric contraction. All right. Skeletal muscle physiology is in the background. Let's return to our case, right? We said this guy's he had chronic upper back and neck pain. We're looking at his scapular stabilizers. Maybe we want to test. So if he's in front of you, you want to test your hypothesis, right? You're going to think that maybe some muscles are weak here. I think a really good muscle to test might be the lower trapezius. Right now, can you picture the position you put your patient in for lower trapezius manual muscle testing? Picture it in your mind. Close your eyes. Pause the video. Do you know it? Do you know which position you're getting into? Hopefully. Looked a little something like that. Huh? The lower trap. All right. So what are you going to do during a manual muscle testing? If you want to do a good manual muscle test, are you going to get him in position, put your hand there, and then push as hard and as fast as you possibly can? Hopefully not. If Jeff Wilkins taught you anything in tests and measures, I would hope that when you put your hands on your patient, you begin to gradually build your force. Yes? What are you doing there? Why did they hopefully say that over and over and over again in tests and measures? Hold, 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 and you're building to see if you can break them, right? You're not going all at once as super fast, because at a slower velocity, they're going to generate a greater force. If you push with your maximal force really fast, you will beat them because it will be too high of a velocity for them to have generated as much force. So you go slow because you need time for the cross bridges to form so you get an accurate and reproducible manual muscle test. Are you guys getting excited about all this overlap from earlier classes just weaving into our story? Isn't this so exciting? Okay, so your patient has chronic pain. You think it's a muscle weakness issue. You put him in this position. What do we know about skeletal muscle that helps determine the output of that muscle? What are we going to be thinking about when we think about what this patient might be missing if we don't think they're creating a great enough force output? In other words, what determines muscle output? So we're in the middle of the page. The first one is probably the most obvious. Oh no, someone's trying to call me. I don't know if that happened in spring, that someone tried to call. Probably did. Everything happened in spring. All right, so the first one is the most obvious, and that is cross-sectional area, which doesn't appear very normal on this slide. So the torque of a muscle is directly proportional to the cross-sectional area of the muscle. That's probably the most intuitive of this entire list. If you increase the total number of cross bridges, you will increase the strength. And any one of you know that who has ever seen a before and after picture of some guy or gal who gets beefed up at the gym, and once they are stronger, their muscles are obviously larger. Okay, so torque of a muscle is directly proportional to the cross-sectional area of the muscle. If you have more actin and myosin in a muscle, you will have an increased number of cross bridges. If you have an increased number of cross bridges, you will have an increased number of strength, because force is equal to the total number of cross bridges within that sarcomere. Okay, so this is pretty obvious, right? If these two people were in front of you and you had to guess which one had a greater force output of their scapular stabilizers based on sight alone, I think most of you would pick the gentleman on the right? Because the cross-sectional area of his muscles just looks larger, right? He's got good girth to his muscles. But that is by no means the only thing, right? It's not that simple. The size of the muscle fiber is a huge component, and that's one of the things that you probably even looked at, and you're starting to get those observational skills that just looking at someone, you can see that there's not a muscle belly there, and you're kind of putting that into your diagnostic wheelhouse of what might be going on with this patient, because muscle size is a huge contribution to force. There's other elements, though, within the molecular property of the skeletal muscle that has a huge impact on force as well. And that is that there's different types of skeletal muscle cells. So this is a slide of a cross-section of muscle cells, and you can see these happen to be stained for myoglobin. So myoglobin is basically the hemoglobin within the muscle cell. It's what carries oxygen. So the darker muscle fibers have an increased amount of myoglobin. So that means they have more capacity to deliver oxygen to their mitochondria, which is where we make all the energy in the cell to fuel muscle contractions. Whereas the light pink ones have a lot less myoglobin, which would mean that they probably have a less ability to generate ATP aerobically using oxygen. So if we look at these two different muscle fiber types, they have a lot of different properties that are distinguishable between the two of them and contributes to their performance and how it might impact how the patient can use that muscle in the setting in which they need to use their muscle. So the first can be type 1, right? So in this figure, our type 1 muscle fibers were the dark, stained for myoglobin, really good at using oxygen. So other names for type 1 muscle fibers, as listed in your notes, sometimes they're referred to as slow twitch muscle fibers. Some are referred to as slow oxidative. So this is a muscle fiber type that is very good at using oxygen. You can see some points below this that further describe the functionality of these different muscle types. And the first one that's listed is that it's fatigue resistant. Slow twitch muscle fibers, or type 1 muscle fibers, can generate force for a very long period of time because they're very good at using oxygen to make ATP. They can fuel the molecular machinery to keep the contraction going for a long time. So point number 2, they're very good at oxidative metabolism, that's using oxygen to make ATP. And we know this is true because they have a very high mitochondrial volume. We are going to go through this later in the semester if this isn't a concept that's very strong for you, but the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's where we actually manufacture the ATP. These cell types have a very high capillary density, a rich blood supply. Why does that matter? Oxygen is carried in the blood. The only way you can deliver oxygen to this highly oxidative metabolic tissue with tons of mitochondria is if there's blood flowing by it. So they have a lot of capillaries and they have a ton of myoglobin. As we mentioned in the previous slide, they're staining dark. Where do you see type 1 muscle fibers? In parts of the body that need to maintain contractions for a long period of time. So these are dominant in our postural muscles. They have, in general, a slower maximal velocity. These are not good for like power, fast output, but very good for slow and steady wins the race. They can go all day long. That's type 1 muscle fibers. Type 2 are sometimes referred to as fast twitch muscle fibers, and there's 2 subcategories of type 2. But in general, type 2 muscle fibers are less oxidative than type 1. But let's look at the 2 subtypes. So on the bottom of your notes, there's type 2X. And if it helps you remember when you're studying, think of the X as like a star, because type 2X are super awesome. Like so fast, so good, so strong. They're the best. They get a star. So type 2X are called fast twitch or fast glycolytic. These are our power muscles. They can generate a ton of force incredibly fast. They are very good at what's called glycolytic metabolism, meaning they can make ATP without any oxygen at all. So you don't need to wait for the heart to increase the heart rate and the blood flow to increase going to it to get the ATP. Bam, they can just make it because they've got the machinery within their own muscle. They don't want to take up space with a bunch of mitochondria that need oxygen to make ATP, so they don't have as many of them. So fewer mitochondria, tons of glycolytic enzymes. that little enzyme that lives in the myosin head that hydrolyzes ATP, it's called myosin ATPase, has a super high enzyme at functional activity, a high Vmax. It can make ATP incredibly, it can break down ATP incredibly quickly. And while that's good for power, it does make them less efficient, because the higher the myosin ATPase activity, they actually have a greater energy expenditure per unit of work performed. So they burn through their energy really, really fast, but they can make it really fast. This is a much more dominant muscle fiber type in the lower extremity. Okay, so that's 2X, super awesome, super fast, star, amazing. Which brings us to type 2A. And you can think of the A as standing for almost as good. So if 2X is awesome, fast, superstar, 2A is almost as good. That's the A one. That helps you remember. It is the intermediate between the two. It is sometimes referred to as fast oxidative glycolytic, meaning it kind of can do both. It's got a little bit of both worlds. It has the ability to use oxygen, but not nearly as well as type 1. It has the ability to form ATP without oxygen or through glycolysis, but not as good or as fast as type 2X. So it makes it moderately resistant to fatigue, where 2X's are going to burn through it really fast. 2A, almost as good as type 1 in its ability to resist fatigue. It is extremely adaptable muscle fiber type. This is one that likes to kind of shift and act a little bit more like a 1 or a little bit more like a 2X, depending on your training. It's also more dominant in the upper extremity. So if you're looking at that muscle and you're trying to determine its muscle output, the types of muscle fibers that are in that bulk muscle that you're looking at will play a role in its total output. And that is because these different fiber types can actually produce different total amounts of force. So this figure is from Dr. Newman's kinesiology textbook. So you guys have this book, and it's looking at the force, the twitch response in 2X super awesome star, 2 almost as good, and then slow. And you will see that the total grams produced is the highest in Mr. Super Awesome Star. It's about midway between the two for 2A. It can create a decent amount of force, not nearly as much as the fast twitch. And slow twitch has a really low, right, total amount of force. But then if you look down here on fatigability, the 2X super awesome is not super awesome at resisting fatigue. And it's going to peter out extremely quickly. 2A will be able to hold on a lot longer, but will eventually peter out as well. And by that turn of phrase, I mean not be able to generate the same total amount of force for a long period of time. Whereas the type 1, this is where they shine. Look at this, 60 minutes, still at the same amount. So they're extremely fatigue resistant. They can keep their contraction going. So depending on what you need, you might really value one or the other, but they have their own unique sets of strengths and weaknesses. I just put this table in to show, this is looking at the percentage of slow fibers and percentage of fast fibers in different athletes, and know that they used cellular markers that wouldn't change with training, but rather things that were in the cell to show you what is the proportion of type 1 or type 2 muscle fibers in these different athletes. And it really shows that somewhere along in your life, you kind of self-select what you're good at. In these elite distance runners, they had a ton of type 1 fatigue resistant muscle fiber types, and then kind of at the expense of the powerhouse. Whereas you look at track sprinters, these are the ones that are going to need power, explosive activity, the much greater percentage of fast twitch muscle fibers. So we are just genetically given a certain array of muscle fiber types, and it very much dictates what we can do functionally and how those muscles will perform. All right, so we're looking at what influences muscle output. And we mentioned this myosin ATPase enzyme when we talked about type 2X muscle fiber types, but I just want to revisit it as its own slide because it is an important element to the force production. So this is an enzyme that lives kind of right on the myosin head. So it's right where you need it. So right by where the ATP will bind, there's this ATPase enzyme, and it catalyzes the hydrolysis of ATP. And by that I mean it is the enzyme that rips that one phosphate off to release the energy stored in the bond of the ATP. So this is the enzyme that hydrolyzes ATP and that activating the myosin step of the cross bridge. And there are different isoforms of myosin ATPase. As we mentioned, type 2X has the highest rate of contraction because of the high rate of enzyme activity of its myosin ATPase. But there's a variety of isoforms of this myosin ATPase that might have different efficiencies at hydrolyzing ATP that can impact the total force and the speed at which they get to total force. All right, so when that person was sitting in this perfect lower trap manual muscle testing position, and you slowly built up your force to allow for a slow velocity and a maximal isometric force generation, just the total number of cross bridges formed is influencing how well they're able to resist your force, but also the muscle fiber types that are there are going to impact how much force is being generated within that individual muscle fiber. And we all have a different genetic background and code that contributes to that. All right. Other factors that might contribute to the total amount of force that this patient's able to generate has to do with the neural factors. So we started this whole phys talking about that motor neuron that comes down and embeds in the neuromuscular junction. Well, that plays a role in how well you're able to generate muscle force, the ability of those neural factors to talk to the muscle. So on the slide, you can see it says, what is a motor unit? Hopefully by now you've heard that term before, but a motor unit is a motor nerve and all of the motor units it innervates. Okay, so every motor nerve branches off and a lot of different branches go to a certain grouping of muscle fibers and then they all fire together. So a motor unit is a motor nerve and all of the motor units that it innervates. And the innervation ratio is different based on the functional needs of an individual muscle. So an innervation ratio is how many muscle fibers per nerve, right? So if you need big movements, you want a high innervation ratio. You want to be able to fire as many muscle fibers as you can at one time. We don't have to just bulk movement, bulk force. Where small, delicate movements, needing to kind of play the piano with your fingers, you might want a low innervation ratio. You want to have fewer muscle fibers per nerve so you can turn exactly what you want on and off. You have more control. So the number of motor units is going to impact the total force, and that comes in with the motor unit recruitment. So how many motor units are going to get turned on? And when a motor nerve fires, all of the fibers that it innervates will contract together maximally. Okay, so when the motor unit is recruited, when that motor neuron fires, all the fibers are going to contract with it. And so it matters the type of motor unit you're talking about, given that innervation ratio, that the type of motor unit pattern will impact the total amount of force. So let's look at that in relationship to our muscle fiber types. So again, this is type 2X, super awesome. Type 2, almost as good, and type 1. And you can see that slow oxidative muscle fibers typically have a lower innervation ratio. You have fewer muscle fibers to an individual nerve. Where the higher big power players, you have really high innervation ratios. One nerve is going to turn on a really big section of the muscle all at one time. And the order of recruitment you can see here on the bottom. When your brain first tells you that you want to get muscle going, it is going to follow what's called the size principle. The smallest motor units are going to be recruited first, and those are your slow twitch muscle fibers. Part of the reason that the smallest motor units are recruited first is simply because the smaller the motor unit, the smaller the nerve, and the smaller the nerve, the lower the threshold for activation. So it's more quicker. It will be easier to get that nerve to get an action potential. So the smaller nerve and smaller motor unit is recruited first. As that neural signal continues, you'll start to grab larger and larger nerves and greater proportion of motor units firing. So progressively larger motor units. So you go to 2A next, and eventually you're going to kick in those 2X. This is another way of looking at that same figure. You can see force production on the x-axis. So as we move to the right, we're generating a greater and greater amount of force. And then the recruitment threshold on the left, or on the y. So you can see first you get very low amounts of force, and it's very easy to turn on type 1. As you need a greater and greater activation threshold, you're going to get greater and greater amounts of force, but now you're getting predominantly type 2 muscle fibers in a much larger motor unit pattern. And that is the size principle. So these neural factors, as in which nerve gets activated, how large of a motor unit is getting turned on, is also going to be playing a role in the total force output in this case. The next one is just the ATP availability. So how well is your muscle producing ATP? And this is a figure that we will go through later in the semester for those that aren't as familiar. But out in the cytosol, this side of the pathway, you can make ATP anaerobically, meaning without any oxygen, or you can go within the mitochondria and generate tons of ATP through the process of oxidative phosphorylation. The ability of the mitochondria to make ATP, you get a ton more ATP if you go through the mitochondria. So how well a muscle is able to keep its cross bridges going has to do with its ability to generate appropriate amounts of ATP. So the number of mitochondria within the cell will indicate kind of how well it's able to generate that ATP and provide the energy necessary to cock those myosin heads. ATP ultimately comes from the breakdown of stored energy products. So how well we have stored energy in our body that we can use, carbohydrates and fats, and then the delivery of oxygen to the cell as oxygen is required by the electron transport chain to form ATP. So if you have adequate blood flow going through your cell, you'll be delivering oxygen, forming ATP, and that would contribute to the total amount of force if you're able to feed the muscle the necessary energy to create its cross bridges. So yeah, we'll do this now. Okay, so this is a graph that we're going to return to over and over again. Oh, and I'm seeing on this format it's a little funky. But just relating that muscle output back to blood flow. So throughout this semester, we will use, my husband really wants to get a hold of me right now. Throughout this semester, we will use this figure to show how the oxygen that comes into the lungs has to be delivered to the body through the heart and lungs to ultimately flow by the muscle, because the muscle needs that oxygen to go to the mitochondria and make ATP. So how much blood flow is going through the muscle is going to be a huge factor in the total output of force. I just put an extra slide here to introduce this concept here, because as you remember from pathophys, hopefully, there's a lot of diseases and conditions that might impact blood flow. A lot of peripheral arterial disease and clotting that can impact flow, that can have a huge impact clinically on your patients. So if these are the factors that are influencing how much force this guy is generating when you do your manual muscle testing, the question is, what can we change? He wants help. He wants less neck and back pain. We've identified some weaknesses in some muscles that are contributing to this poor posture, that's probably contributing to strain on some of his support structures. What can an exercise prescription do to the muscle fiber type, to the ATP supply, to the size, to the neural factors, to the blood flow? Can we make a change? Stay tuned.